We have been doing a sermon series on David. Today's the fourth and final one. We did the anointing of David the first time, where David is called forth to be the king of Israel. Then we did David and Goliath. Last week we did David and Bathsheba, the killing of Uriah, the taking of Bathsheba as his wife. And today we're going to do David on his deathbed. 1 Kings, 2nd chapter. The screens are working. Thank God for little blessings, don't you? When David's time to die drew near, he charged his son Solomon, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. That's a wonderful line. We'll talk about it in a minute. Be strong. These are his final words to his son Solomon. Be strong, be courageous, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. Then the Lord will establish his word that he spoke concerning me. If your heirs take heed to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, there shall not fail you a successor on the throne of Israel. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. When I was in the 5th grade, I don't know how I remember this far back because there are a lot of things I can't remember that happened yesterday. Some of you were there. When I was in the 5th grade, I read a book. It was a biography of the great scientist Albert Einstein. And I wrote a book report about it. I don't remember anything about the book or the book report except the ending of the book, and I used that as the ending of my book report. It was the deathbed scene of Albert Einstein. He was in an American hospital. He was in his final minutes of life. And right before he died, he turned and whispered several sentences to his nurse. The problem was that he spoke in his native German, and she only knew English. And so the great irony that the final words of perhaps the greatest genius who ever lived were lost forever. That didn't happen with the great David. We are so fortunate that this deathbed scene of David is recorded for us. We see David in this wonderful panoramic view. From the time he's a young child out in the pasture taking care of the sheep until this final moment that he's on his deathbed. And he turns to his son Solomon, to whom he's passing on his legacy, his kingdom. This is the heir that has been chosen. He turns to him, and in this wonderful verse, he says, I am about to go the way of all the earth. That's a remarkable line, I think. David, having lived through all sorts of wars and trauma, sin and life, victories and defeats, David has come to this place where he has this perspective on his own mortality. He says, I now understand that what's about to happen to me has happened to my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents. It's happened to one of his sons. He had lost men in battle. He'd seen it. And he has this remarkable perspective. He says, I'm about to do what every human being who ever lives does. I'm about to go through the door into what lies beyond life on this earth. I think it's a nice reminder to you and me about the importance of dealing with our mortality and recognizing that mortality is a part of who we are. We live with it. I love what Will Durant, the great historian, I think Dr. Durant lived into his 90s, but he once said, death is a great invention. It makes room for new life on earth. And that's the wonderful place of peace that David has arrived at when he turns to Solomon and says, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. It's with no sadness or fear. This is the way life is. And then the next several verses, he recounts what his legacy is to his son Solomon. And it's really, really interesting. David has reached the pinnacle of achievement for a human being. He's been a king. He's killed Goliath. He's won many, many military victories. He's had the trappings of royalty and power and wealth. All of these things that have been a part of what he's worked for and who he's been all these years. And yet on his deathbed, not a single word about any of those things. Instead, he talks to Solomon his son, and he says, be of good courage, do not be afraid. And the most important thing that I pass on to you is the importance of my relationship with God. The importance of living faithfully and meaningfully in relationship to God. It's an extraordinary moment in which this great king has distilled down into a few sentences what he wants his son to know and to remember. Last weekend, I think it was, maybe 2 weekends ago, Mike Flynn and I did the memorial service for the father of Stacy Johnson, one of our church members. And her husband, Dave, gave part of the eulogy about his father-in-law. He did a great job. I asked Dave if I could quote him today. He said, you know, I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago. I think it was in Nashville or someplace. It was a place where some high-powered people gave a speech that was different from anything I've ever heard at one of these conferences. Because usually it's about, you know, winning at all costs or setting goals. What is your vision for life? Managing for success. He said this speaker talked about life. He said he was talking to a bunch of CEOs and COOs, driven people. But he said this is what he said. He said, we spend the first half of our lives building our resume, our CVs, right? He said, you know, we want to graduate from high school and then we want to try to get into the best college possible. We think we want that on our resume. Graduated from, I'm not going to name a college. You just name your own. I'll get in trouble. Graduated from a great college, and then we maybe want to go and get a master's degree or some graduate education and have another great name of a school on our resume. Then that first job, and then maybe some professional successes or recognitions or awards in that job. Then the second job, better salary. We get married. We want to move to the right neighborhood, buy the right house, join the right civic organizations. All that time, we're writing. We're building our resume. And he said there's really nothing wrong with this. It's something that we all do. But this man, who had grown older than most of the people he was addressing, said we need to spend the second half of our lives writing our eulogies. Our eulogies. So that's what really counts. Because when you come to that final moment and people gather to say goodbye, to offer gratitude for your life, they really don't care if you were the CFO or the president or the CEO. They don't really care about how much money you made, how powerful you became, how big your home was. What really counts in that moment is whether you cared about your family, whether you were generous and compassionate with other human beings, whether you supported your church and other civic institutions that make life better for everyone, whether you lived your life with passion and compassion, whether you leave behind a life that will be remembered for its goodness. And then Dave said, I'm grateful for a father-in-law who taught me what it's like to live life in such a way that you leave behind a eulogy as well as a resume. That's pretty powerful stuff, and really, it's the reason we all come to church on Sunday mornings, isn't it? Those of us who are here every Sunday morning, it's just because, I don't know about you, but I need to be reminded every single week because life is seductive. Things can seduce us. But this is what happened with David. We find him here in this moment. We see him in those 4 chapters of his life when he see him out there just a boy being called. His father Jesse calls him in and being called to service. We see him there defeating Goliath. We see him in his moment of greatest weakness and sin with Bathsheba, sending her husband Uriah off to die and taking her for himself. And now he's arrived at this moment of In so many ways, this moment where he has achieved the maximum in terms of power and fame and wealth, and none of it means anything. None of it means anything. He says, Solomon, this is my final legacy to you, what I want you to remember. Live your life with courage, trusting in God. You know, this is Celebration Sunday, and we've been talking during the month of January some about stewardship, and I have to say to you that I've gotten to where I don't much care for the use of that word stewardship, and I'll tell you why. It's really my own fault. As I've looked back, I've thought, you know, whenever we use the word stewardship, we're usually saying stewardship campaign. We should say finance campaign, right? And stewardship campaign is where we like to inform you about the life-changing ministries of our church. You trust and invest your money with our church, and lives are changed, and I think we make a good case for that. And I'm always pleased and proud to make that invitation, to inform and to inspire and to invite you to participate in those ministries by investing in them. But it seems to me like we've done a disservice to the word stewardship, because stewardship as a concept and as a philosophy is so much bigger and more powerful than just a finance campaign. The real issue, you see, is not our stewardship campaign, but it's the stewardship of our lives. And that's really what we've been talking about here as we've looked at this wonderful panoramic view of the life of David from his birth, from his young childhood until this moment on his deathbed. What did his life add up to? When he comes to this moment, what is it that he leaves behind? And so last week when we talked about that second creation story in Genesis 2, where God stoops down and scoops up the clay and molds it into a human being and blows life into it. I don't know about you, but that's become such a powerful image. I find myself thinking about that image literally almost every day. In my quiet time, my silent time every day, I think about that image, God blowing life into me, and how that is really at the very center of who we consider ourselves to be if we think about this issue of stewardship. We are nothing more than clay, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, until God blows life into us. And then our responsibility is to care for what it is that God has given to us, life itself, to care for the creation, to recognize that life blown into me means nothing other than in relationship to life that God has blown into your life and to others, that we are all connected. And so we think about what it means when we say to live a good life, or to live a life with power and meaning. There is no way to do that without recognizing that we live life on behalf of the God who breathes life into us. And so that means the stewardship of everything. Everything. It means the stewardship of our time when you get up in the morning. How are you going to spend your time? It means the stewardship of our relationships. It means the stewardship of our gifts and our talents. And how could it mean anything other than the stewardship of the material blessings that we have? If you can go down and consider all the gifts and blessings, the way in which you live your life, and you say, well, you know, my money, I can just check that off. I can just move that to another spot. It doesn't make any difference. It's not a part of my commitment to the stewardship of my life, my God-given life. If you can do that, please do so. But I think for most of us, we spend so much of our time with the accumulation of things that the investment that we make with our things, our material resources, our money, how can you talk about the stewardship of life without taking seriously what it is that we do with our material resources? When we look at this final scene with David, some of those great truths of life just become so obvious. You catch a person in the middle of life distracted by so many things, building that resume. Sometimes it's easy to forget about those virtues that we want in the eulogy. So we've talked about these 4 different phases of David. The young child called, the great warrior, the first of many battles where he fells Goliath, wins the battle. And then the story about David and Bathsheba that we talked about last week. We didn't really finish that story. He wanted Bathsheba, he took her. When he recognized that he wanted her permanently, he sent her husband Uriah into battle to be killed. And there was a price to be paid. His first son with Bathsheba, whom he loved dearly, died. And he was heartbroken. There was a price to be paid for his sin. But then today, we see him on his deathbed. And he has asked for God's forgiveness. He's been forgiven. And we see David forgiven and redeemed, and as a human being and as a child of God, more powerful than ever before. There's a little footnote to this story that's really important. He's getting ready to hand off the kingdom to his son Solomon. Do you remember how we've talked about this before? There's a great theme in the Bible. In every period in which the Bible was written, both Old Testament and New Testament, the son who was supposed to inherit everything was always the eldest son. But not, in all these Bible stories, over and over and over again, we see a younger son inheriting the kingdom or being chosen, as David himself was. Today, we see him handing over his kingdom to his youngest son, Solomon, who was the son of Bathsheba. The final proof that David has been both forgiven and redeemed. He passes on his legacy, and he dies in peace. May it be so for you and for me.